A reading from Hebrews chapters 4 and 5. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him.
For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weakness. Hebrews 4:14. To take out the double negative, we do have a high priest who is able to sympathize with us in our weakness. But this is not the insipid sympathy of, oh, poor you, that actually means little. It is not the cheap sympathy we might often express that costs us nothing. The word used in this passage is sympathos, much stronger. We have in Jesus Christ our great high priest, one who is able to suffer with us, sympathos, to suffer with us. He is with us in our struggles. He is with us through thick and thin. We have come, it seems to me, desensitized to the profoundly shocking words in the prologue of John's Gospel. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The creator of all that is, the cosmos, the universe, the multiverse of everything that is born as one of us, as fully human. And the word John uses for flesh, in the Word became flesh, that word is sarx. It denotes not simply humanity, but the frailty of humanity, human weakness, human vulnerability. It denotes God's total identification with us in our human frailty. So in every struggle we face, God is with us. This is the incarnational reality, God with us in the reality, in the mess of our lives. So the question for us today is perhaps, how are we living out that human solidarity with others who are struggling? If we know that this is how God in Christ is with us, how are we as those in whom Christ lives, living this out with those who are struggling and suffering around us? How true are we being to Christ among us, with us, and amongst the suffering? Are we being true to this? Are we doing this, or are we in fact, to borrow a phrase from this pandemic, social distancing as the church, keeping ourselves at arm's length from the suffering? In parenthesis, I find myself deeply uneasy with any thinking that suggests clergy should not be free to minister to the dying, if that thinking is based on the protection of clergy from danger. Reputable historians, for example Kyle Harper and Rodney Stark, have argued that it was the pandemics of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and later the 6th century, that led to a huge growth in the Christian faith. The 3rd century pandemic, reckoned to be something like SARS, wiped out an enormous number of people, hundreds of thousands, at its peak killing some 5,000 a day in Rome. Many cities in Italy and Africa lost more than half their populations. Most people left the cities, leaving behind the sick and the dying and the dead. Most people. But the Christians stayed behind with them to care for them. The Christians looked after not only their own, not only other Christians, but all those who were suffering. Bishop Dionysius in the 3rd century describes how Christians, in quotes, were heedless of danger and took charge of the sick, attending to their every need. Emperor Julian in the 4th century, who tried and failed to eradicate Christianity from the empire, attributed his failure to, in quotes, these pale Galileans who look after not only their own, but ours as well. The presence and compassion in action of these early Christians attracted many thousands to Christ. These Christians were living out the incarnational love of God. God not fleeing suffering, but God among the suffering. Demonstrating, in the words of St. Anthony of Egypt, that our salvation is with our neighbour. Fast forward to 1527, when the bubonic plague comes to Wittenberg. Martin Luther refuses calls for him and his family to leave the city to protect themselves from the plague, choosing rather to stay and minister to the sick. The decision leads to the death of his daughter, Elizabeth. Luther writes a tract entitled Whether Christians Should Flee the Plague. He concludes emphatically that they should not. We are to be with and for and among the suffering. What we are seeing so evidently and movingly now is the NHS actually living out this kingdom dynamic, as I call it, in service and costly self-sacrifice, irrespective of any faith position. In their care for the suffering, they are demonstrating what Jesus calls us to do. When God's will is done, God's kingdom comes. And so I can, and I do, in all good conscience, see the NHS and its costly service, and indeed many others, costly service to the afflicted and dying as being of God. One of the gifts hidden within this world pandemic crisis is perhaps a greater sense of our common humanity across the races and nations of the world. A common humanity rooted in a common vulnerability. COVID-19 is no respecter of persons or races. It is indiscriminate in its destructive outreach. So we are perhaps being invited into a greater solidarity, not only with our brothers and sisters in Christ, but also with our brothers and sisters in humanity throughout the world. Many of us have been thinking and praying especially for Christians in Bethlehem who have been cut off with the whole population of Bethlehem from any visits and any pilgrims. And the Christian community there is, of course, entirely dependent on pilgrimage for their livelihood. In Pakistan, I'm told, Christians and other minorities, which include Sikhs and Hindus, are being denied COVID-19 food aid, which is being delivered only to Muslims. This is what I have read. I'm sure it may not be entirely true, but I guess there is some truth in it. In India, Christians and other minority faiths, including Muslims, are not receiving food aid under a nationalist Hindu regime. And so on across so many countries, and so much worse in some other countries. How are we living out that deep solidarity in Christ to which we are called and to which Paul refers when he writes, "If one member suffers, all suffer with it"? Some of us have been in Kenya recently and were so richly blessed by God in the people we met. Their hospitality and generosity out of great poverty, their joy in the Lord, and the church growing. There is significant material poverty, where 59% of the people lack access to safe water, and over 60% have no electricity. How will life be for them in these days as the virus spreads? With no running water, no ambulances in much of the country, almost no health service in parts, no ventilators, and so on. One of the team I led there reflected to me that our news in the West and in the UK, and perhaps also our personal thinking, is focused on the haves, like us, the haves who suddenly find they have not. It ignores the many countries, the many peoples full of have-nots who are so much more vulnerable to the destructive effects of the virus and would long to have what we have, even in our lockdown. So what is Good Friday saying to us personally? What is Good Friday saying to us corporately about the God who suffered for us and the God who suffers with us? What might God be prompting us to do? For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us in our weaknesses.